No one in that church expected silence to turn into something the human mind could never explain. It was a quiet afternoon mass in a small stone church in northern Italy, where the air smelled faintly of burning candles and polished wood. The congregation had gathered as they always did, seeking peace and prayer and reflection, unaware that this ordinary moment was already carrying the weight of something far beyond human understanding. Inside the sanctuary, Father Gabriel stood at the altar preparing to lift the Eucharist, as he had done thousands of times before. Yet something in the atmosphere felt different in a way no one could name or explain. A stillness began to spread through the pews, not the normal silence of worship, but a deeper kind of pause, as if time itself had slowed down. Sister Elena, who was assisting nearby, noticed first that the light above the altar seemed to lose its natural warmth, turning slightly dim, as though the room itself was holding its breath. No explanation was spoken, yet every person inside the church felt the same unspoken question rising in their hearts. Father Gabriel raised his eyes toward the consecrated host, and for a brief moment, he hesitated, as if something within him was being called into attention. Then it happened, without sound, without warning, without movement that could be clearly explained at first glance. The Eucharist in Father Gabriel's hands began to change in a way that defied every expectation of the congregation. A faint red tone appeared at the edge of the sacred host, subtle at first, then unmistakable as eyes widened across the pews. Sister Elena stepped back instinctively, her breath catching as she realized she was witnessing something no theological explanation could easily contain. A collective silence deepened as the entire church seemed to share a single realization that something sacred was unfolding before them. No one moved, no one spoke, and even the smallest sound felt as though it could disturb what was no longer ordinary reality. Father Gabriel, now trembling slightly, kept his gaze fixed on the Eucharist as the impossible transformation continued unfolding in real time. What had begun as a faint anomaly had turned into a moment that no one inside that church would ever forget. The air itself seemed to respond, as if the room had become aware of a presence that could not be seen, but could undeniably be felt. And in that suspended moment between fear and awe, the Eucharist continued to reveal something that would challenge everything they thought they understood about faith itself. What happens next inside this silent church would later be described by those present as something beyond language, beyond theology, and beyond what any of them believed was possible. Yet at that exact moment, no one knew whether what they were witnessing was a miracle still unfolding or a message that would change them forever. Inside that sacred moment, beyond comprehension, as silence deepened again in that church, the moment that followed felt heavier than silence itself, as if the entire space inside the church had lost its normal sense of time and sound. Father Gabriel remained standing at the altar with his hands still raised, but now there was an unmistakable hesitation in his posture, as though every instinct within him was struggling to comprehend what his eyes were showing him. The congregation did not speak, yet their collective stillness carried a kind of pressure that filled every corner of the room. Sister Elena slowly moved closer again, her steps careful and uncertain, her attention locked on the sacred host that had now become the center of every gaze. The faint transformation that had begun earlier was no longer subtle. It had become visible enough that no one could dismiss it as imagination or trick of light. A deep sense of disbelief moved through the pews, not in panic, but in a quiet and overwhelming confusion that left people frozen in place. Some lowered their heads instinctively, as if trying to process what they were witnessing without breaking the sacred atmosphere, while others kept their eyes fixed forward, afraid that looking away might cause them to miss something they would never see again. The church lighting seemed unchanged physically, yet emotionally it felt different, as if the brightness itself had taken on a solemn weight. Father Gabriel finally lowered his voice, but no words came out, only a breath that seemed to carry the weight of unanswered questions. Sister Elena placed her hand over her chest without realizing it, her expression caught between reverence and shock, as if her understanding of the moment was shifting in real time. The congregation remained united in silence, yet within that silence each person was experiencing something deeply personal, something that could not be easily shared or explained. The air felt unusually still, and even the smallest movements, such as the flicker of candlelight or the slight shift of clothing, sounded amplified in the minds of those present. It was as if reality itself had narrowed down to a single point of focus, centered entirely on the altar. Father Gabriel took a slow step back, not out of fear, but out of a sense of awe that seemed to require physical distance to be understood. Sister Elena looked toward him briefly, searching for reassurance, but found none that could be spoken. The moment stretched without resolution, creating a sense that something was continuing to unfold even if no one could yet understand its direction. And in that suspended uncertainty, the church remained locked in a shared experience that felt less like witnessing an event and more like standing inside a question that had not yet revealed its answer. The uncertainty inside the church deepened as the moment stretched into something that no one could measure by ordinary sense of time anymore. Father Gabriel slowly lowered his raised hands, yet his eyes never left the sacred altar, as if breaking focus would mean losing the only explanation he might ever have. Sister Elena stood only a few feet away now, her breathing steady but unusually controlled, as though she was trying not to disturb the fragile atmosphere that had taken over the entire room. The congregation remained completely still, yet their stillness was no longer passive. It was active, alert, and filled with a shared tension that no one dared to break. The faint change upon the sacred host had become clearer, and what once felt like uncertainty now carried the unmistakable weight of something undeniable. No one spoke, yet silent. Reactions passed between people through small movements of their eyes and hands. A few lowered their heads slightly, not in prayer alone, but in an attempt to process something that felt too large for immediate understanding. Others remained fixed on the altar with unwavering attention, as if afraid that even a blink might cause them to miss the next part of what was unfolding. Father Gabriel finally took a slow breath and stepped slightly to one side, his movement careful and deliberate, as though even the air around the altar required respect. Sister Elena followed his gaze, and for a moment her expression softened into something closer to reverence than shock, as if her mind was beginning to shift from disbelief toward acceptance of the moment itself. The lighting inside the church seemed unchanged, yet emotionally the space felt altered, as if every surface carried a quiet weight that pressed gently but constantly on those inside. The candles near the altar flickered in a way that drew subtle attention, not because they moved differently than before, but because every detail now felt amplified by collective awareness. Father Gabriel did not speak, but his lips moved slightly, as if forming words that never reached sound. Sister Elena placed both hands together in front of her, not in formal prayer, but in a natural response to something that demanded attention beyond language. The congregation remained unified in silence, yet within that silence there was a growing sense that each individual was encountering something deeply personal. Some felt confusion, others felt awe, and others simply felt a quiet stillness that made it impossible to think in ordinary terms. The sacred host remained the center of all attention, and though its appearance held everyone's focus, the true weight of the moment seemed to extend beyond what could be seen. Father Gabriel finally looked upward for a brief moment, as if searching for understanding that could not be found within the physical space of the church. Sister Elena followed that gesture, but found no explanation there either. The moment did not resolve, it continued, suspended and unfolding, leaving everyone present inside. A shared experience that felt less like witnessing an event and more like standing within something that was still becoming real. The stillness inside the church did not break, but it changed in quality, becoming heavier and more emotionally charged, as every person present began to understand that what they were witnessing could not be dismissed as coincidence or imagination. Father Gabriel remained near the altar, his posture now less rigid and more human, as if the weight of the moment was slowly reshaping his sense of responsibility into something deeper than ritual. Sister Elena stood slightly behind him, her eyes fixed on the sacred host, which continued to hold the attention of every soul in the room like a silent focal point that no one could escape. Around them, the congregation began to shift in small but significant ways, not moving away, but moving inward emotionally, as if each person was being drawn into a shared realization that exceeded individual understanding. A woman in the front pew gently brought her hands together, not in formal prayer, but an instinctive response to something that felt larger than her capacity to interpret. A man further back lowered his head slowly, not out of fear, but as if acknowledging that words had become insufficient. The air in the church felt steady yet charged, as though every breath taken carried meaning beyond its physical function. Father Gabriel finally turned his head slightly towards Sister Elena, and in that brief exchange there was no spoken language, only recognition that neither of them could explain what was unfolding. Sister Elena's expression softened further, transitioning from uncertainty into a quiet form of reverence that seemed to grow stronger with each passing second. The congregation's silence was no longer passive. It had become participatory, as if every person was contributing to the same unseen moment of awareness. Subtle sounds like the shifting of fabric or the faint creak of wooden pews felt amplified, reminding everyone that they were still grounded in a physical space even as their attention was pulled towards something beyond it. Father Gabriel took a slow step closer to the altar. Again, not with hesitation this time, but with a careful sense of duty, as if approaching something sacred that demanded full presence rather than reaction. The sacred host remained unchanged in form, yet overwhelming in significance, anchoring every gaze and every thought within the room. Sister Elena closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again, as if testing whether what she saw would disappear, but it remained constant, steady, and undeniable. The congregation began to show signs of shared emotional response, not chaos but unity in reaction, as some quietly knelt, while others simply remained standing in stillness that felt more like surrender than observation. Father Gabriel finally exhaled slowly, a breath that seemed to carry both disbelief and acceptance at the same time, while Sister Elena placed one hand over her chest again, as though grounding herself in the reality of the moment. No one in the church moved to leave, and no one spoke, because speaking would have required a level of explanation that none of them yet possessed. Instead, they remained together in a collective awareness that what they were experiencing was no longer just an event unfolding before them, but something that was reshaping their understanding of presence, meaning, and the boundaries of what they believed possible within that sacred space. The silence that had filled the church began to evolve into something more complex, as if the moment itself was now carrying layers of meaning that continued to unfold without interruption. Father Gabriel stood near the altar with a stillness that no longer reflected uncertainty, but instead a deep internal struggle between understanding and surrender to what was being witnessed. Sister Elena remained close by, her attention unwavering, as the sacred host continued to hold a presence that seemed to draw the entire room into a shared focus. Around them, the congregation remained unified in quiet observation, yet their inner responses had begun to diversify into deeply personal experiences. Some individuals appeared absorbed in contemplation, their eyes fixed forward without blinking, while others gently lowered themselves further into kneeling positions as if responding to an unspoken invitation to reflect inwardly. The atmosphere inside the church felt stable yet profoundly altered, as though the space itself had shifted from being a place of ordinary worship into something that required complete emotional presence. Father Gabriel finally moved his hands slightly, not in ritual motion, but in a slow and deliberate gesture that suggested he was attempting to reconcile what he saw with everything he had ever understood about faith. Sister Elena turned her head briefly toward the congregation and noticed the shared expression of quiet awe that seemed to connect every individual without words. No one appeared frightened in the traditional sense, but there was a noticeable sense of emotional gravity, as though each person had been placed in front of something that demanded reflection beyond explanation. The sacred host remained unchanged in its physical appearance, yet its significance continued to expand in the perception of those present, becoming the undeniable center of their awareness. Father Gabriel lowered his gaze momentarily, then raised it again, as if confirming to himself that the moment was not fading. Sister Elena placed both hands together once more, this time holding them steady, not as a formal prayer, but as an instinctive response to a presence that felt both intimate and overwhelming. The congregation remained silent, but their silence was no longer passive. It had become a shared form of attention that bound them together in a single unspoken experience. Subtle movements such as the shifting of posture, The slight tilting of heads and the gentle closing of eyes indicated that each person was processing the moment in a deeply personal way while still remaining connected to the collective experience. Father Gabriel took a measured breath and looked towards Sister Elena again. And in that brief exchange, there was a mutual understanding that neither of them had the language to fully describe what was occurring. The church lighting remained steady, yet the emotional perception of the space continued to feel heightened, as if every surface carried significance beyond its physical presence. The altar remained the focal point, and everything within the room seemed to orient itself around it naturally and without resistance. Sister Elena's expression softened further, reflecting not resolution but acceptance of mystery, as if she had reached a point where understanding was no longer required for reverence. The congregation continued to remain in place, unified not by instruction but by shared awareness, each person quietly encountering a moment that felt suspended between the known and the unknown, where time itself seemed to lose its usual structure and everything present existed only within the still unfolding weight of what they were collectively witnessing. The atmosphere inside the church began to shift once again, not abruptly, but in a gradual progression that felt almost imperceptible at first, as though reality itself was adjusting to something that had already been set in motion. Father Gabriel remained near the altar, his presence steady yet deeply attentive, as if every second required him to remain fully anchored to what was unfolding before him. Sister Elena stood slightly to his side, her gaze still fixed on the sacred host, which continued to hold the center of every awareness in the room without any need for movement or sound. Around them, the congregation entered a new stage of collective perception, where silence was no longer just absence of speech, but a shared state of heightened attention. Subtle changes began to emerge in the reactions of those present, not through words or gestures, but through synchronized stillness that suggested a growing unity of understanding. A few individuals shifted their posture almost at the same time, as if responding to an internal cue rather than an external one, while others remained completely motionless, their focus unbroken. Father Gabriel slowly lifted his eyes again toward the altar, and for a brief moment his expression reflected something deeper than uncertainty, a recognition that the moment was continuing beyond any expectation of resolution. Sister Elena noticed this and followed his gaze, her own expression now reflecting a quiet acceptance of the extraordinary nature of what they were experiencing. The lighting within the church remained consistent, yet there was a subtle perception among those present that the space itself had become more concentrated, as if every detail was drawn inward toward a central point of meaning. The congregation's collective silence now carried a sense of shared anticipation, not of fear, but of waiting for something that had not yet fully revealed itself. Father Gabriel took a slow step closer to the altar again, his movement deliberate and careful, and as he did, several members of the congregation instinctively leaned forward slightly, mirroring his attention without conscious coordination. Sister Elena's hands remained clasped, but her posture had become more grounded, as if she was fully present within the moment rather than reacting to it. A faint sense of unity spread through the room, not spoken or visible in any direct way, but felt in the shared stillness of every individual present. Even the smallest sounds, such as breathing or the shifting of fabric, seemed to exist on a more noticeable level, reinforcing the sense that the ordinary boundaries of awareness had been refined into something more focused. Father Gabriel's gaze remained steady, and in that steadiness there was a sense of continuity, as if the moment was no longer progressing forward in time, but unfolding within a suspended present. Sister Elena looked briefly toward the congregation and saw that many of them had adopted similar expressions of quiet contemplation, suggesting that whatever they were experiencing was not isolated but shared across the entire space. The sacred host remained the focal point of all attention, and although no dramatic change occurred at that instant, its significance seemed to deepen in a way that was felt rather than seen. The church itself remained unchanged physically, yet emotionally it felt as though every person within it was participating in a single, unified awareness that continued to expand without explanation. Father Gabriel finally lowered his gaze slightly, then raised it again, not in doubt, but in acknowledgement that the moment was still unfolding beyond the limits of immediate understanding. Sister Elena remained still, her expression now calm, as if she had reached a place where observation and faith were no longer separate responses, but part of the same experience. The congregation continued to remain together in silence, bound not by instruction but by shared presence, as the moment extended further into something that felt both timeless and deeply real, leaving all who were present within a space where meaning continued to form without yet arriving at its conclusion. The moment inside the church reached a depth that felt unlike anything that had come before it, as if the entire space had settled into a level of stillness that no longer required explanation or expectation. Father Gabriel stood at the altar with a composed but profoundly attentive presence, his eyes fixed forward in a way that suggested complete immersion in the unfolding reality before him. Sister Elena remained close, her posture steady, her expression calm, yet deeply engaged, as though she had entered a state where observation and understanding were no longer separate experiences. Around them, the congregation continued to remain unified in silence, yet the quality of that silence had changed again, becoming more reflective and inward, as if each person was now processing the same moment through a deeply personal lens while still sharing a collective awareness. No one moved in any disruptive way, yet subtle shifts could be seen in the way people held themselves, with some leaning slightly forward and others remaining completely still, all directed toward the same focal point without needing instruction. Father Gabriel slowly adjusted his stance, not as a reaction but as a quiet acknowledgement that the moment was still continuing beyond any natural pause. Sister Elena followed this with her eyes, noticing that even the smallest gestures within the church now felt significant, as though nothing could be considered ordinary within this space anymore. The sacred host remained unchanged in form, yet its presence continued to dominate every perception in the room, not through physical alteration, but through the intensity of attention it commanded. The lighting in the church remained steady, but the emotional perception of the environment felt even more concentrated, as if the boundaries of awareness had narrowed to focus entirely on what was happening at the altar. Father Gabriel's expression reflected a growing sense of clarity mixed with awe, not confusion, as though something within him was aligning with a truth that did not require verbal confirmation. Sister Elena gently lowered her head for a brief moment, then raised it again, as if acknowledging internally that the experience they were part of was not meant to be fully defined in that instant. The congregation's silence now carried a sense of continuity, as if time itself was flowing differently within the church, stretching each second into something more meaningful and expansive. A few individuals closed their eyes briefly, not in withdrawal but in deeper reflection, while others maintained steady focus on the altar, reinforcing the shared center of attention that unified everyone present. Father Gabriel took a measured breath and remained still, his presence steady and grounded, while Sister Elena stood with a calmness that suggested acceptance rather than uncertainty. The entire space felt bound together by an unspoken awareness, where no single person was isolated in their perception, yet each experience remained deeply individual in feeling. There was no disruption, no movement of urgency, only a continuous unfolding of a moment that seemed to exist beyond normal structure. As the silence persisted, it became clear that what was happening inside the church was not concluding, but continuing to develop in a way that kept everyone present fully engaged within a shared state of profound attentiveness, where meaning seemed to be forming slowly, without finality, within the stillness itself. The atmosphere inside the church had reached a level of stillness that no longer felt temporary, but instead felt sustained, as if the entire space had settled into a continuous moment that refused to fade or resolve. Father Gabriel remained at the altar with a composed presence, his eyes fixed forward in a manner that suggested full acceptance of the unfolding reality, even as the depth of its meaning continued to expand beyond immediate comprehension. Sister Elena stood nearby, her posture unchanged yet fully engaged, her attention directed toward the sacred host, which still held the entire congregation in unified focus. Around them, the people inside the church maintained their silence, but that silence had transformed into something more reflective and intentional, as if each individual had entered a state of inner observation that was both personal and shared at the same time. There was no visible movement that disrupted the moment, yet subtle signs of emotional processing could be seen in the way some individuals held their hands together, while others remained completely still, all directed toward the same central presence at the altar. Father Gabriel lowered his gaze briefly, then raised it again, not as a reaction of doubt, but as a quiet acknowledgement that the moment was continuing without interruption. Sister Elena followed this motion with her eyes, her expression steady and calm, as though she had moved beyond the need to interpret and was instead fully present within the experience itself. The lighting in the church remained constant, yet the perception of the space felt increasingly concentrated, as if every element within it had been drawn into a shared focal point that extended beyond physical observation. The congregation's stillness now carried a sense of continuity that suggested time was no longer experienced in a linear way, but instead in a slower and more deliberate unfolding that allowed each second to hold deeper significance. Father Gabriel took a measured breath, maintaining his position at the altar, while Sister Elena remained beside him, her presence steady and aligned with the atmosphere that now filled the room. No one in the congregation spoke or moved in any noticeable way, yet there was a collective sense of heightened awareness that seemed to unify every individual into a single, shared moment of attention. Some individuals appeared to gently close their eyes for brief periods, not in disengagement, but in deeper internal reflection, while others kept their gaze fixed forward with unwavering focus. The sacred host remained unchanged in appearance, yet its significance continued to dominate the entire space, not through physical transformation, but through the intensity of perception it inspired. Father Gabriel's expression reflected a quiet certainty that did not require verbal explanation, as though the experience itself was communicating meaning beyond words. Sister Elena stood with a calmness that suggested acceptance of mystery rather than resolution, fully present in a moment that continued to unfold without conclusion. The church itself felt unchanged in structure, yet completely transformed in atmosphere, as if every corner of the space now carried a shared awareness that extended beyond individual thought. The congregation remained together in silence, unified not by instruction but by experience, each person existing within the same suspended moment where attention, reflection, and presence converged into a single continuous awareness that had not yet reached its final form. The silence that had filled the church for what felt like an extended passage of time began to settle into a final and deeper stillness, one that no longer carried tension or anticipation, but instead a sense of complete presence. Father Gabriel remained at the altar, his posture steady, his gaze no longer searching but resting in quiet acknowledgement of everything that had unfolded. Sister Elena stood beside him, her expression calm and fully composed, as if she had reached a point where understanding was no longer required for acceptance. Around them, the congregation remained together in unified silence, yet that silence now felt complete, as though every internal question had found its place without needing spoken resolution. The sacred host remained the central focus of the entire church, unchanged in form, yet fully transformed in meaning within the hearts and minds of those present. There was no movement of urgency, no visible reaction of confusion or fear, only a shared stillness that carried the weight of reflection and reverence in equal measure. Father Gabriel finally lowered his eyes in a slow and deliberate motion, not as an ending but as an acknowledgement of something that could not be contained within a single moment of observation. Sister Elena followed this gesture, her hands still gently together, her posture reflecting a quiet stability that suggested full presence within the experience rather than separation from it. The congregation remained in place, but the emotional intensity of the moment had shifted into something more internal, as if each individual was now carrying the experience within themselves rather than reacting to it externally. Some maintained their gaze toward the altar, while others appeared to rest in silent reflection with lowered heads, all equally connected to the same shared reality. The church lighting remained unchanged, yet the atmosphere felt complete, as though the space itself had reached a natural resolution without any external conclusion. Father Gabriel stood still for a final moment, then slowly stepped back from the altar, his movement calm and controlled, signaling not departure but transition into reflection. Sister Elena remained where she was, her attention still directed forward, her expression composed and peaceful. The congregation did not move in response, but instead remained together in unified silence, as if recognizing that the moment they had experienced was not something that ended abruptly, but something that would continue within their memory and understanding. The sacred host remained at the center of the altar, now no longer the focus of change, but the focus of contemplation, holding its place as the anchor of everything that had been witnessed. Father Gabriel finally turned slightly toward the congregation, his expression reflecting quiet reverence rather than explanation, as if no words were necessary to define what had already been experienced collectively. Sister Elena looked across the room once more, observing the stillness that remained among the people, and in that stillness there was no confusion, only a shared sense of having been present for something deeply significant. The church itself returned to a state of ordinary quiet, yet nothing within the perception of those who were there remained ordinary. The experience had settled into them not as a moment that passed, but as something that would remain with them, shaping their understanding of faith, presence, and meaning in ways that would continue long after the silence inside the church had fully returned.